North Korea is obviously getting food assistance, financial assistance, and then I think what Kim Jong-un wants the most, which is advanced missile technology and advanced military technology. And it's the latter, the missile and military technology, about which we know very little.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. We're going to be talking about two things this week. One is about the reports, now apparently confirmed, of North Korean troops moving to the Kursk region of Russia to help Russia in its fight against Ukraine. And then we're going to pivot and we're going to talk about military conscription, national service in democratic countries and whether that works or not. And I've got a great group of people here to talk about all this. We've got Orysia Lutsevych, the head of our Ukraine Forum. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Very good to have you. And Professor Yossi Mekelberg, a senior consulting fellow with our Middle East and North Africa program. Welcome, Yossi.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
Again, there has been a lot of Middle East recently, and I'm delighted to say that joining us from Oxford is a newcomer to the podcast, Dr. Edward Howell, who is, we're very proud to say, the Korea Foundation Fellow with our Asia Pacific program and also a lecturer in international relations at Oxford. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Bronwen. It's very good to be here.
Very, very good to have you all. Well, it's been an interesting week. Let me start with our first topic. We had this week NATO's new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, confirming what South Korean and Ukrainian intelligence agencies have been saying for days now. And that is that North Korean troops are present in Russia and they're on the way to the front line in Kursk. And there are two views on this. Is it a big humiliation for President Putin? It shows that he doesn't have enough troops. He's having to call on his newish ally, North Korea. Or is it a worrying escalation, bringing in troops and an ally from a very different part of the world in a way that makes lots of countries say, what's North Korea getting in return? Could that have worrying implications for South Korea? So we're going to plunge into that first before we get on to these also very interesting questions of conscription. Orysia, let me start with you. What do we know about this development?
So what we know today is that North Korea is sending part of its special force, that some includes pilots and light infantry. Some of them already been deployed inside Ukraine and around Kursk, and some are still on training basis. Ukrainian intelligence says that includes 3 high-level generals, deputies of general staff of North Korea. They're likely to be integrated within Russian but different battalions. One is Special Buryat Battalion, in order to conceal, to kind of blend them in the similar ethnically looking infantry. Location of this is still unknown. The reason is that basically what you've said at the beginning, is it Russia's humiliation or is it escalation? And actually I think it's both. It's because Russia is failing to achieve significant results on the battlefield that it resorts to drawing more manpower and drawing more materiel and kit from its allies.
I was just come back from a conference in Brussels where some Russian voices were saying, no, humiliation, but others saying, no, big escalation. And from what you said, these are fairly senior people. These are not just fodder for the awful, as they've been called, mincemeat machine of Putin's war effort. These are senior and special forces.
There is a highest level of military involvement of North Korea personnel in this operation. It does include also possible, mid fodder of light infantry, as I said. It doesn't seem to be like they're moving high, machinery with them for motorized brigades. But I think that it's actually quite expedient for Putin because he doesn't have to mobilize more of his own people, insulating them from this war further. Well, I also heard Russians saying in Moscow and St. Petersburg, there are enough people who are willing to fight for money in Russia so we can continue living our life comfortably.
So, Edward, what do you make of this? How should we interpret it?
I think that this marks an escalation in the relationship between Russia and North Korea. We know that up to this point, North Korea has been supplying Russia with 122 and 152 millimeter artillery shells. This was the start of North Korea's involvement in the Ukraine war. And then this escalated to North Korea supplying ballistic missiles. And earlier this year, debris from the missiles were found in the Kharkiv region, amongst other regions as well. The escalation in terms of the sending of troops, and we must remember that who are these troops? In addition to both lower and high-ranking officials, we also have civil personnel. Okay, weapons advisors, weapons technicians, to assist the Russians and also their North Korean counterparts in using North Korean weapons. I think crucially, this highlights how on the 19th of June, when Putin and Kim Jong-un signed this comprehensive strategic partnership treaty, that's what they called it, within which involved a mutual defense pact, North Korea and Russia's relationship, whilst fundamentally transactional in terms of their origins, have now escalated to a new level. And I think that's something that we need to bear in mind.
What do you think North Korea is getting in return?
So, North Korea is obviously getting food assistance, financial assistance, and then I think what Kim Jong-un wants the most, which is advanced missile technology and advanced military technology. And it's the latter, the missile and military technology, about which we know very little. What specific technologies are traveling from Russia to North Korea? We know that North Korea needs to and wants to improve its satellite technology capability. We know that Kim Jong-un has made clear that he wants North Korea to improve not only its conventional weapons capability, but also its missile delivery systems. And so I think this is why the relationship cannot simply be dismissed. And also, in my view, even if the Ukraine war were to end in the not so distant future, I don't think that Russia would simply drop North Korea, akin to how the Soviet Union did at the end of the Cold War.
Really interesting. And does it make them together a little more independent of China? Is that something that they want? They're both obviously junior partners in some sense of their own partnerships with China.
The China question is a very important one because I think that initially, when the relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang developed, I think Beijing's position was quietly cautious. China still has not made public statements outlining its stance on this issue, but I think China has a dilemma. On the one hand, it clearly wants to retain influence over North Korea. China signed the Korean War Armistice Agreement, and China is obviously a far more important partner for North Korea, not least economically, than Russia is. But on the other hand, China is dissatisfied. The West's response to North Korea and North Korea's rapprochement with Russia, namely the US is strengthening alliances with Japan and South Korea. But I think now that the evidence of North Korean troops being sent to Russia is getting ever clearer, China will be less happy and actually quite uneasy at this strengthening relationship, which has developed reasonably quickly in a very short space of time.
That is such an interesting point. Yossi, I wanted to bring you in here because there's a lot of talk, obviously, about Iran currently in the Middle East, from Arab countries, from Israel. And there is a certain amount of talk about Iran's relationship with Russia, with China, whether this is becoming an axis of something. You can add your noun of choice at the end of that, axis of autocracy, some go for. But how has this move of North Korean troops into on the side of Russia gone down?
I think it all points to one thing, that real politics is live and kicking. They're just following their interest and they're moving very quickly. We live in the post-Cold War in a world with that ideology plays a very little role, if at all. So they're looking into enhance their nuclear program. Russia is potentially can help them. Russia is desperate to having more manpower, so then it all works for both of them. Now, it's the same goes for Iran. Iran being isolated, the sanctions that hit hard. Economically, Iran suffers along the years. It creates some opening, whether it's with China or with Russia. Russia is desperate to get drones, get ballistic missiles. Iran is happy to supply, and hinder alliances and realliances work for both sides.
Orysia, do you listen to these things? And indeed, did you look at the BRICS Plus summit that has just ended in Russia and see Russia getting lots of allies, or is it something much more pragmatic, as Yossi was implying?
Yeah, I think it's a glimpse into this transactional world that we may be all living soon through, and I think this what is in common among these powers is that they want revisionism. It's I call it the axis of revisionism. China,
There you
Russia,
go. We've got
Iran.
yet another one there.
I think this is the closest description of what it is they want. And one thing that Edward didn't mention, what North Korea gets, is this kind of combat experience. They will be able to see how American weapons are performing. And they're also talking about South Korea as being the principled enemy. Perhaps this comes as a bit of a speculation, but if China might support some kind of a forceful reunification between North and South Korea, itself thinking of a forceful reunification with Taiwan and creating another contingency for America, right? Now, Xi was very clear in Kazan. He said, and I quote, we want rapid de-escalation of war, and we don't want this to be spreading to the third parties and not add fuel to the fire. But this is exactly the opposite what President Putin is doing now. So the big question is whether this is in contrary to what China says, or China is keeping implausible deniability by just saying, I don't know what's happening.
And we called for the flames to go down, and they didn't. Do you think in the case of these particular troops, they're going to make much difference in the conflict?
Well, the feeling in Ukraine from military experts is they are not going to change like the course of war dramatically. You know, even if it's 12,000 men, they may help take a couple of villages in Donbass, but the front line is unlikely to completely collapse. And if Ukraine, deploys these HIMARS, they will kill equally North Koreans and Russians in large numbers like Ukraine was able to do it so far. And then, honestly, we should be all interested in these North Korean troops not coming back to North Korea, not bringing that know-how, technology and combat experience back to the region.
Edward, I wanted to come back to this question of what they might be bringing back to the region. Is South Korea seeing any threat to itself from what North Korea might be getting?
I think South Korea at the moment is quite concerned. South Korea has been saying time and again that it would not supply lethal assistance directly to Ukraine. It has said this on numerous occasions ever since the Russia-North Korea relationship began. Or was renewed. But I think one of the key concerns is that North Korea's foreign policy towards South Korea has fundamentally changed since the turn of this year. North Korea now no longer views South Korea as part of the same, albeit divided, Korean peninsula. Kim Jong-Un has thrown out of the window the idea of reunification, at least, given what he said earlier this year.
What he said was it was very forceful, wasn't it? It was saying we regard you almost, I'm paraphrasing, but as enemies, not as family.
Exactly. I think one of the phrases he used was primary foe, the principal foe. And so I think this puts South Korea in quite a difficult position, because not only is South Korea now concerned that actually Russia could supply North Korea with technology that would not only help North Korea develop its nuclear capabilities, its missile systems, and its weaponry, but that there is a possibility that Russia could supply North Korea with technology that North Korea could then subsequently use in any provocations against the South. And this year we've already seen an escalation in North Korean provocations towards South Korea.
Just one point about acquiring combat experience. It's a double-edged sword. If it goes well, yes, you get the experience and you can use it elsewhere. But you're fighting in a completely foreign terrain, culturally different. And we saw it in other occasions. For instance, Hezbollah in Syria. You're losing people. People are injured. You need to look after them as a result of that. Americans in Vietnam, yes, they got a lot of experience, but it didn't end very well. So I think there is a double-edged sword to it, which we'll see how it's going to end.
Well, we hope Kim is listening to you on that.
It is a real point, and it was one that the Ukrainian ambassador was making here on the stage at Chatham House just a week or two ago, saying Ukraine is getting so much skill it could actually pass that on to NATO. But as you said, it also erodes very quickly. We're going to leave that topic there, not that we're at the end of it, but leave the axis of resistance, of autocracy. What was it you said?
Revisionism.
Revisionism, there you go. I'm afraid the word reminds me of a terrible episode of it back in friendlier times with Iran when I invited the Iranian press councillor to a restaurant called Axis in Covent Garden, and he said, it is because of the axis of evil. I was trying to explain, no, it was because they cooked without alcohol. But anyway, it is seared onto my brain. Let's go to this second question, which I've been wanting to bring to the podcast for some time, about national service or conscription, and look at some of the countries that use it. And Yossi, I want to start with you. Israel has national service for everyone, men and women, and you and I were up on the border of Lebanon just the day before the pagers exploded, and I was asking an IDF commander how long it took to make a good soldier, and he was saying sort of 6 months minimum. But you've been through this.
This commander, this colonel, they try to portray it's quite easy, but still we need to make them. It takes time to make a soldier, young person into soldier, and it's interesting there are more and more female soldiers in combat units in Israel and as pilots. That was not the case at the beginning. Yeah, it takes time, and I can still remember my first day as a conscript, moving from just completing the equivalent of A levels, and the next day you are on a bus to a boot camp.
And can you choose when you do it? What is the letter that you get?
Well, when you're around 17, still in high school, you get a letter that tells you that you volunteer by law to join the
marvelous phrase.
It's great. I think it's part of the psychological warfare to confuse you. And then to control you, tells you, am I volunteering or am I obliged to serve by law? The answer, yes, you're obliged. In Israel, of course, there are certain communities that don't oblige by law even to volunteer.
A point of big national division now. They're very orthodox.
As we speak.
Yes.
It's debated, the ultra-orthodox, religious women, young females that don't have, even if they're not ultra-Orthodox. Israeli Palestinians don't have. They can volunteer if they like. Though it's universal, it's not completely universal. But then through the boot camp, that basically what they try to do is to break you in order to rebuild you as a soldier. And the idea that you're ready to sacrifice your life for the cause, that you obey orders. So from a teenagers that don't have the tendency to obey any orders, into a soldiers that follow order, to build a camaraderie between your friends and people that some of them never met before. All of a sudden, they become your life, your friends, the people that your life dependent on them. So it's a transition and transformation.
So very powerful in that sense, and of building solidarity against a common threat to the nation. But what about in extended wars, as Israel is facing now, extended conflict on many sides, albeit some of its own choosing? Is the other forces, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, are they up to that?
So the system in Israel built on conscript, the professional army, which is very small, and mainly reservists. So over the last year, 300,000 reservists have been called service. Some of them served up to 300 days in 1 year, meaning basically they served throughout the year, with here and there time off to go home. That's different because we saw it also in the 1973 war. The role of the conscript was to stop the first wave of attack, to allow around 72 hours to mobilize the reservists, and they do most of the job. It's a method that Israel developed along the years because it's a small country. It was even smaller then compared to the quite massive Arab militaries.
At that point. But now having to draw on all those reservists is hurting the economy.
Absolutely. The cost of reservists is around 9,000 to 10,000 pounds a month, compared to around 5,000 to 5,500 pounds a month of a conscript.
Does that mean the cost of taking them out of their regular jobs?
And the contribution to the economy.
Right. Yes.
So,
yes, that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I mean, and you need to pay them. You need to house them and feed them and clothe them.
And they're away from their families. We started hearing about the reservist divorces and all this.
Yeah, and there is extra cost. And if in an economy that also women are more and more involved. It means childcare. So there are all in all costs. Though with conscript, there is also a delayed cost because for now they might have earned less because they are young, but it means they enter into the economy, the labor market, 3-4 years later. So there is a delay cost to that too.
That is a really interesting point. Edward, can you take us into the South Korean experience? I think now partly because of BTS and other boy bands, the requirement for young male Koreans to go into national service, albeit at some time of their choosing up to a certain age. That is well known, but how is it working?
Yes, so as you say, it's clearly stated in the South Korean constitution that if you're an able-bodied man between 18 and 35, that you should serve in the army for between 18 to 21 months. Now, there are obviously exemptions, but the rule is pretty clear, irrespective of your status, whether you are a BTS pop star or whether you are a Korean golfer earning millions of dollars a year in the United States, you have no choice. I think conscription in South Korean society has become extremely embedded. It's basically got the status of a rite of passage. There's a saying that says that you go into the army a boy and you come out a man. So the decision by some South Koreans, particularly celebrities, to emigrate abroad, renounce their citizenship as a way of evading conscription is viewed with a lot of disdain. Now, I think there is a challenge that is being seen at the moment, though, which is that South Korea has one of the lowest birth rates of any OECD country. And this is likely to decline further over time. So the question of how South Korea will cope with that, given a declining number of individuals willing to join the military, in the face of north of the border, an army that stands at 1.4 million in North Korea, one of the most militarized societies in the world, is a very clear and pressing threat and a challenge that South Korea will have to face in the future. There have been questions about how to evolve the existing system.
Do you mean that they need to look to technology more than individual soldiers as the answer to that threat?
That's one possible alternative. So South Korea has tried and is trying to reorient its military from one focused purely on manpower to one that's focused on science and technology, and particularly with South Korea's development of AI and unmanned vehicles and AI combat systems. But ultimately, this still relies on people with the knowledge and the skill set to operate them.
Which takes me to a really interesting point that I, in a way, was trying to discuss with this IDF commander and have with those in Britain, which is how long it takes to make a good modern soldier, given that a lot of the equipment is really very, very complicated these days. It's not about learning how to fire and clean a rifle.
It's a difficult one because, as I've said, in South Korea, when you're conscripted, you should serve in the army for between 18 to 21 months, after which you become a reservist for between 6 to 8 years. There are obviously lots of challenges with this. The most obvious one is that this takes a decent chunk of time outside of when you might be in your prime. You might be at university, you might be starting out in your career. And the question of what makes a good South Korean soldier, I think, will also be made ever more complex given the two challenges that South Korea will face: deterring China as one form of challenge, as China continues to advance its technology, but also deterring an increasingly belligerent North Korea.
That is a really, really interesting point. And would you say it still works for creating a sense of national solidarity? I mean, there is this big fuss and debates in Parliament when BTS have to go off at some noticeable hit to the economy and so on. But it still works in that purpose?
I think for now it does. I think for a lot of people, they've accepted the inevitability of it. It will come. It's something that everyone has to do without really much choice, if any. And I think there's a growing recognition, actually, that the North Korean threat south of the border is an imminent one, and it's an immediate one. I mean, it's all very well, a lot of South Koreans would say, focusing on China. China is an important actor. China is an actor that is trying to destabilize the Northeast Asian region. But what about this country north of the border, which now no longer views us as part of the same nation or part of the same peninsula, which now views the South as the principal enemy, the principal foe?
Absolutely. I've always found the War Museum in Seoul extremely moving, as a portrait of how the country has responded to all the other countries and people who've tried to tramp over and take it over and so on. If I'm right, there is a turtle ship that was never defeated in the front hall of this museum.
Yes, it was used by the Korean Navy in the Joseon dynasty from the 15th to around the 19th century. It's an important landmark and a very stark and prominent model that you can see there.
Even if not a technology used today. So, Orysia, let me come to you finally. Let's talk about Ukraine, which is in the heart of this at the moment, with conscription obligatory, but not until age 25, is it now? It came down a year from 26.
Yeah, it's a bit complicated, but I think what is a common theme here is how stressful and expensive it is to live with insecurity. All these countries are facing neighbors that are threatening them. Israel, is often compared in Ukraine. People are saying we should be like Israel. We should be able to be indigestible for Russia and mobilize for this long resistance if we want to pursue our path of development and future. So in Ukraine, it's men from 18 to 60 that are now in the times of war eligible for mobilization, but only those from 25 and onwards could be sent to the front line. So the younger generation is being trained as a conscripts to build a reserve.
So they're being trained at the moment. And if
not everybody. So what happened is Ukraine, once the war started, Ukraine, everybody had to register with the local military office. So all men had to have a registration. Now, once they are registered, they could be called into any moment, only from 25 years old. And right now, yesterday, actually, there was a statement by the head of the National Security Council. Then in addition to 1.5 million that has already been drafted, Ukraine needs to mobilize to add on further 160,000. That is the goal. So that means Ukraine needs to replenish the manpower on the front line, which is very long, more than 600 miles. Plus, it needs to build reserve in order to be able to rotate people. And what's interesting, when we will be talking about democracy, all these countries are democracies. So there's a lot of discussion about it. It's not a totalitarian system like in Russia, or autocracy say, you must go and fight, no questions asked. In Ukraine, people are saying, what is fair service? How do we equally distribute the burden among the rich and the poor, among the villages and the cities, among the frontline regions and among home front?
That sounds great, but if you're over 18 and you're male, you're not allowed to leave the country, are you?
Absolutely, you're not allowed to leave the country. And what's interesting, we have quite a lot of women serving in Ukraine, more than, I would say 15%, drone operators, snipers, paramedics, and they are supporting. It's enormous a number of people that you need to wage this kind of land war. One soldier on the front line, it means that you need at least 7 back support with everything in order to sustain the front line.
And just in these numbers, which are huge, tell us about the casualty numbers, which are also huge.
Well, again, Ukraine is not officially publishing its casualties numbers, but I will tell you one statistics: 50% of Ukrainians have somebody that they lost already in this war, a family, a close friend, and that this touches everybody almost. And that Ukraine, it's visible, the drama, the tragedy is visible. It's not like it will be a shock on the day when the government will publish official numbers.
Edward, I didn't ask you whether there was any suggestion in any of the debate about women serving in the Korean National Service.
These points have been raised, and there has been a question of whether the idea of conscription should become more a sort of volunteer-run army. But existing statistics show that, female volunteers only account for around 3%, if that, of South Korea's current military. So I think one of the lessons we can take is actually how difficult it is, even in a democracy where there is a system of conscription, how difficult it is to try and overcome and work out alternative solutions at a time when countries are facing big domestic issues. In South Korea, the most obvious one, as I've mentioned, being the low birth rate, and what this means moving forward when you're trying to combat multiple threats.
So let me ask the three of you, just for your instinct at the end, not for any great formal or academic projections, but we've got lots of countries around the world, I'm thinking though particularly of Europe at the moment, and indeed the UK, of trying to spend more on defence, of trying to do more about their defence in what is a very insecure world. Do you see national service, conscription being something that countries might reach, or based on the experience of the countries you're looking at, is it something that works for national spirit, for actually contributing to a fighting force, or is it really created in such special circumstances in each of these that it's not really a policy, of all the policies countries might be reaching for, not one to roll out across the world? Just asking for your, out of interest, for your instincts.
It's very different from country to country. If you go up in a place like Israel, this is part of the ethos. It's also regarded as the big equalizer within the society.
It goes right to the heart of Israel's founding soul, if you like.
Completely. And it goes even before. You have, for instance, those who served in the underground before the war, including female soldiers. So it's really part of the ethos of the country. But I think also for what we talk here, the cheapest way to ensure security is peace. Way more than having big armies. It's an expensive exercise. It harms the economy. And also from a social point of view, look what happens in all of these wars. Many people that are killed, injured, post-traumatic stress disorder. There is an extra pay from a social point of view, from an economic point of view.
That's a very good point. But it doesn't just end with the war.
It doesn't. Some of people carry this with them for the rest of their lives. I'm supporting national service, but not necessarily a military one.
There's a really interesting point, because my question was prompted partly by thinking of the previous Prime Minister here, Rishi Sunak, saying, briefly, just a few months before he called the election, that was the end of him, saying, I'd like national service for young people, though he did quickly say maybe that is just going to be litter picking, not military. Edward?
I think just very briefly, I don't think these debates are going to go away, not least given how I think one of the fundamental lessons that the Ukraine war is teaching us at the moment is that conflict in Europe is not limited to Europe. As our discussion has showed today, it is fully transnational. And also given the fact that the UK is focusing very much, or has focused in the past very much, on the Indo-Pacific, given the fact that there are multiple simultaneously occurring crises globally, I don't think that these debates are suddenly going to disappear.
I actually think Ukraine is quite an interesting case to look at, because it's so hard trying to kind of reconcile between the tension and needs of the very intense war, and also trying to preserve some normalcy of life, keeping up an economy, and also trying to modernize the system of mobilization, where a person has a bit more choice, what kind of profession you want to do, how the army could be also for you a career advancement. For example, reaching out really to veterans to understand how they can do post-war socialization back to normal life. But I think what Ukraine also shows, and it was very effective in the first days of war, it's this territorial defense units. So what we need is to design whole of society approach, I think, that fit modern threats. Not everybody has to learn to shoot. You need to also train people in cognitive resilience, how to distinguish disinformation. And I think it's a complex system. It goes way beyond just the armed forces. And I think Finland is another interesting case that is trying to embed this whole of society security that includes conscription, that includes resilience, and includes territorial defense. So it's multi-layered, I would say, in a modern way, how we should be doing it.
Really interesting. I'm thinking, as you were talking, of the US Army, where the technical units have been a huge engine of social transformation, of kids going into them from school, getting very, very expert, coming out in their 30s with a bit of a pension, and a second career in the IT industry.
A lot of the technical, the high-tech revolution in Israel is actually originated in the military of 18 years old, go and serve and work on the most sophisticated weaponry in the world, and then they go into the real life, the economy. That's where the high-tech revolution started.
On that note, we're going to have to stop, and I was really going to try and get through this podcast without mentioning the UK budget. But what Yossi was just saying is notes on a postcard to the Chancellor, who has just finished. We're going to have to stop there. It was a fascinating discussion, and so thank you so much to Orysia Lutsevych, Yossi Mekelberg, Edward Howell. Follow them all on X, other social media. You can find their details in the show notes as usual. And we're gearing up now not only for the US election next week, but also the COP Climate Summit taking place in Azerbaijan. We put out a great report on that. Do look that up. And this week we hosted Todd Stern, the lead US negotiator for the landmark Paris Agreement. We also hosted the elders with Ban Ki-moon and Helen Clark this week. And the details and videos from all those events can be found on our website, chathamhouse.org. And a reminder that you can find all the episodes of this podcast, Independent Thinking, on all the major platforms as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow, subscribe and share. Bracing ourselves for the US election next week. And of course, it may not end next week. But for now, goodbye from me, Bronwen Maddox. See you then.